In this lecture, we'll be examining classical Indian philosophical traditions and their role in the history of the Indian subcontinent. Let's first begin with a brief rundown of some terminology so that we are all literally and figuratively on the same page when it comes to the terms used. When I use the word Hindu, I'm speaking about a term used to describe a wide variety of people with similar ethnic, linguistic, religious, and social characteristics. Hindu. In terms of Indian, I'm referring to a term used to describe people of the Indian subcontinent. The term Jain refers to a small religious minority in India. It's one of the Earth's oldest religions. The term Buddhist is a spiritual and philosophical tradition based on the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, who we'll speak about in a few slides. The term Vedas, which translates roughly as knowledge, refer to sacred texts of the Indian subcontinent and the peoples of the Indian subcontinent. And finally, Sanskrit is the original religious language and the basis for most of the modern Indian languages, the languages of the Indian subcontinent. Briefly, we should also discuss the Hindu caste structure. This is a traditional social hierarchy. Unlike social hierarchies that have emerged in the Western tradition, once you were born into a particular caste, you stayed in that caste for life, and your children would be born into that caste. You're not allowed to marry out of the caste, and there were hundreds of subcastes below these. The Brahman were the priest class, the Kshatriya were the warrior class, the Vaishya were the tradespeople and merchants, and the Shudra were the manual workers. There is another category, technically outside of the caste system, the Dalit, which in the West has been translated along the lines of the untouchables. These are people who are outside the caste structure. There are two groups of Vedic texts, or sacred texts, that have been particularly influential throughout the history of the Indian subcontinent. The Brahmanas, which date back to the beginning of the first millennium BCE. These are a series of commentaries on sacred texts. The Brahmanas in general express the idea that if communicated properly, all sacred Vedic texts are infallible or without error. Primarily, the Brahmanas deal with ritual and sacrifice and mythology. The Upanishads are a bit newer, several hundred years newer. They consist of approximately 200 separate texts that are lumped together as the Upanishads. The term roughly translates something along the lines of sitting down near, suggesting a student who is sitting near a teacher to receive an education. These texts were passed down over many centuries through oral tradition. They dealt primarily with philosophy, meditation, and the nature of two terms that we'll define shortly, which are Atman and Brahman. And it's interesting to consider there are some parallels between the Western tradition, the Judeo-Christian tradition of the Old Testament and New Testament, at least in terms of chronology and topical matters. The term Atman, which translates sort of as true self or soul. This is the sense that we are each unique, that we each have our own soul. For Buddhists and several other religious and philosophical traditions, this attachment to one's own self, or this fixation on Atman, is the source of misery. The term Brahman does not easily translate well into English. The closest parallel probably would be God, but in the Hindu tradition and the Vedic tradition, Brahman is a little different than the God of Judeo-Christian traditions. The infinite, the ultimate reality, the supreme cosmic spirit might get a little closer. The goal in most Vedic traditions is to transcend the Atman, or the self, and become one with the Brahman, or the infinite. This process of transcending Atman and becoming one with the Brahman is known as moksha, M-O-K-S-H-A, which translates roughly as release. So releasing the attachment to self and becoming one with the infinite. Another term we should spend a moment discussing is karma, which has sort of entered the lexicon of pop culture. Good acts bring about good results. Evil acts lead to evil results. Karma in the Vedic traditions carries over into next lives, so you don't sort of lose it from life to life. Samsara, the translation of this term is something along the lines of continuous flow. In the West, we have sort of a limited understanding in translating this as reincarnation. I think that's kind of doesn't quite get the sense of that existence is an endless cycle of birth and death and rebirth and re-death. An individual who has been very influential in a number of religious and philosophical traditions beyond Buddhism itself is Siddhartha Gautama. He was the first Buddha, which means awakened one or enlightened one. Gautama was born into an aristocratic family, yet despite a life of wealth and privilege as a prince, he was troubled by the pain and suffering he saw in the world. For a number of years, he wandered around as an impoverished and ascetic monk. He tried fasting, he tried self-mortification. He still didn't find enlightenment despite this very harsh, painful lifestyle that he imposed on himself. He eventually decided to sit under a peepal tree, which became known as the Bodhi tree, B-O-D-H-I, and he vowed to remain there until he had found the truth, till he had achieved enlightenment. And in this process, he developed what is known as the middle way between the extremes of self-denial and self-indulgence. There are two main components of this, the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. The Four Noble Truths, according to the Buddhist tradition, life is suffering, or dukkha, D-H-U-K-K-A. Suffering, Buddha argued, was caused by desire, the desire to have things. If you want to eliminate suffering, according to Buddhist traditions, you should eliminate this desire for material goods, for attachment. And to eliminate desire, the Buddha argued, you should follow what is known as the Eightfold Path. Our next slide here. Simply enough, if you follow the Eightfold Path as laid out by Buddha, practicing right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, you should do the job that you were meant to do, put forth the right effort, have the right mindfulness and concentration, you can eliminate desire and thus achieve enlightenment. In Buddhist traditions, there are many different paths one might take to enlightenment, to achieve nirvana. There are two main schools of Buddhist tradition. When I say the word school here, we're discussing the general concept of schools of thought, as opposed to specific physical institutions like colleges and high schools. In Mahayana Buddhism, which translates roughly as the Great Vehicle, the goal is liberation from suffering for all beings. This is more dominant in East Asia today. In the present day, there's about 250 million followers of Mahayana Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism which translates roughly as the teaching of the elders, is a bit closer to the original form of Buddhism, and this is a bit more personal path as opposed to a group path, maybe, to generalize here. It's more dominant in Southeast Asia and Sri Lanka, the island once known as Ceylon, and there's about 100 million adherents today in Theravada Buddhism. And that brings to a close our overview of classical Indian philosophical traditions.